Okay, here we are. It's Monday, February 13th, 2017, and what follows is a dramatic reading of UNcensored, a story of being evicted from the UN almost exactly 1 year ago on February 19th, 2016, thrown out of that gate across the street, if you can see it, by 8 guards, laptops smashed in the street, files thrown by the bus stop over there, fake Egyptian media put into the office over there that never comes in. We come in every day now from the metal detectors. We're confined to minders. Ban Ki-moon's had relatives indicted for corruption, which is exactly what we were covering. And the official of Ban Ki-moon, absolutely corrupt, that evicted us, Christina Gayach, was still prancing down the second floor hallway today as we covered with our non-resident correspondence pass the North Korea meeting of the Security Council, unable to go down the hallway, but there she went with Darren Ferrant, bag handler, absolutely corrupt, as are the rest of DPI, Department of Public Information, given 1 year of censorship and no response, no appeal, no anything, should be disbanded and defunded, absolutely cut and destroyed. Here now, Chapter 5, Segment 5 of UNcensored, read from the very park from which we wrote it. And you can even read it. You'll hear what happened. The problem with trying to cover the UN from the park across First Avenue is that your laptop runs out of power. And the scaffolding behind Tudor City is far from watertight. But it can be done. Adrian from Haiti, here in the park every day from 10 to 2, showed me where the outlet was, where I could plug in an extension cord for my laptop. And while the scaffolding wasn't perfect, with a few garbage bags tied to its underbelly, a dry workspace could be formed. But how to talk to diplomats and sources? To some, the word had gone out. An Eastern European staffer, who usually spoke to me at the pre-fabricated stakeout, now came outside. Another even slipped me a draft statement, which I went over to the FedEx to scan and put online. 1 block west was Grand Central, with its long lines for the toilet. Some, it seemed, had taken to sleeping in the stalls. Another guy I met down by the river, in a small park by the FDR Drive just north of the UN. He stored his tent he used in a locker at the New York Sports Club on 48th Street during the day, the same building as the French and UK mission, and the even larger offices of Eng Lap Seng and Frank Lorenzo's South-South News. Since named as NGO 1, by the way, in the UN, one of the first of 2 UN bribery cases of this era. I'd been banned many times from the building, most recently when Ban went to sign the condolence book for the French nightclub shootings. The French mission hadn't wanted me to be there. What was their role in this ouster from the UN? Even my river friends suggested that I write to the U.S. mission. They had to be for free speech, right? The ambassador, Samantha Power, had been a journalist herself once. I shot one rung lower to Power's deputy, David Pressman. He covered Africa in the Security Council, was said to have had a Janjaweed saddle from Darfur in his office in the UN mission building, which had no windows up to the 8th or 9th floor. I had never been to the mid-floors, only to the penthouse ballroom for receptions. The former deputy permanent representative for management and reform, Joseph Torricella, had helped me a few times with information about the Sri Lankan general I pursued, Shavendra Silva. After Torricella left to prepare for a run for state treasurer of Pennsylvania, I'd never once talked to his successor, a woman named Isabel Coleman. She would come into the UN to give short speeches offering praise and then leave. She'd said nothing of the arrest and indictment of former President of the General Assembly, John Ash, something even Torricella and definitely Mark Wallace and his recess appointment boss, John Bolton, would have done. Obama liked the UN. So what if a journalist was in the street? But I tried with Pressman, and to his credit, he responded. Everything would have to be through Isabel Coleman, he said. Great, I told him. The Government Accountability Project, GAP, which defended whistleblowers like my friend Tony Skirtage from when I first got to the UN, had already written to Coleman urging action. Pressman shrugged. It seemed they didn't like to be pressured at the U.S. mission. A woman from a wire service, who'd only filled in sometimes, came by and spoke with me in the rain. Have you tried CPJ, she asked, referring to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Actually, I had. Even before, finally going to sleep after the ouster, I'd written to CPJ's Joel Simon. I'd been told to contact a Rob Mahoney, and I did. Then nothing. No response at all. CPJ came to the UN to launch, as they called it, reports about countries. They did this in the clubhouse of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Mahoney seemed to be thick as thieves, literally, in terms of theft of exclusives, with Reuters' Lou Charbonneau. Still, a journalist thrown in the street? I expected them to do something, but it was not to be. And that's it. Segment 5. We'll have more. We're actually reading this from the very park described. This is the scaffolding. I don't want to have my laptop stolen, so I can't go far. But this is the referenced outlet. Those are the benches at which International Business Times took a picture of Inner City Press writing in the rain, covering this corrupt institution. The corrupt individuals described in this piece. Samantha Power, absolutely hypocritical. Isabel Coleman, a joke in terms of reform. David Pressman, he was good, but he didn't follow through. Lou Charbonneau, corrupt. Preaching today inside the UN Correspondents Association. A total fraud. A joke. Okay, the segment is over, but we'll start an after segment in just a moment. I have a candy melting in my pocket. Okay, this is it. It's Tuesday, February 14th, 2017. What's going to follow is a short reading from UNcensored, the true story of UN censorship for corruption. It's true. This reporter, Inner City Press, thrown out of the UN for pursuing Ban Ki-moon's corruption. And only today, you can also find this online, his longtime deputy spokesman, still hanging around at the UN like so many others, said that to pursue the corruption case is obsessive and called Inner City Press an asshole. That was in the same room from which he and his boss, Stefan Dujarric, threw Inner City Press out, leading to covering the UN from a park. That bench, that outlet, this computer. So we'll read chapter 6, and then we might do another one to comment on it. A little commentary. But here we go. There's a series. You can find the earlier runs on the same Periscope channel, and you can follow along, ideally. Let's see. How long could I keep covering the UN from out on First Avenue? I told myself, forever. Walking back over to the 46th Street Library, when my laptop went dead, I heard a voice calling me as I passed Uganda House. I see you're still reporting, an African diplomat told me. I nodded. Then I have a few stories for you, he said. The first was that even the UN's Rwanda tribunal was being given to a white European prosecutor, Serge Brammertz. I'd covered him in the Lebanon tribunal, then Yugoslavia, but Rwanda, I took some notes. A second story concerned the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations Hervé Ladsus throwing South Africa out of Darfur. He was the fourth Frenchman in a row to run DPKO, to be followed a year after this eviction by a fifth. That would be today. Over in the library, staring out again at Aretsky's Patroon, that's a restaurant, I wrote and uploaded my 2 new scoops, one after the other. When I was done, I found an email from one of my side employers saying they'd heard that what happened, it might be difficult to keep me on reporting. I hit reply and said, don't worry, I'll be getting back in. But would I? When the library closed, once again in the rain, I returned a call to a UN number. This guy had presided over 3 of the GA's 6 committees and had thrown me out of 2 of them. But it was all in good fun. This time he was calling with advice. You should come back in, he told me. If you stay out, people will conclude that you must have done something wrong. Just getting back in would be a victory. If I go back in with a reduced past, I'm giving up my claim to my office, I told him. It's like I'm giving in. It was time to call a lawyer. But who to call? I'd worked on a case with the Center for Constitutional Rights, but their website said they didn't take new cases. There was a guy who tweeted me online, and I settled on him. I've been reading all your tweets, he said. It's like the Stations of the Cross. The reference was ironic, given his location. I'd be happy to write you a without prejudice letter that no precedent is set by you accepting a green P non-resident pass. We can't sue them anywhere? I'm still looking into it, he said. He was being diplomatic. If the UN could kill 10,000 people in Haiti and not even go to court, this one was a slam dunk for them. How about the ethics office, I asked him. Anything to slow them down. Now you're talking, he said. I can draft up something overnight. But it would soon become apparent just how deep corruption runs at the UN. To be continued. Okay, here we are. It's Wednesday, February 15th, 2017. What follows is a reading of the 7th installment of UNcensored. It's a series. going to try to film it so you could read along in case it can't be understood. I tried to ritualize my partial re-entry with a non-resident correspondent pass I would remain confined to for a year and counting. That is, still today. I spent an hour in the morning that day, February 25th, 2016, in the park across from the UN with heroic homeless Haitian Adrian, then talking with diplomats who stopped by, a few UN staffers who gave a thumbs up and then rushed across the street, not wanting to be seen with me. I'd called a reporter from Business Insider who'd once been an intern reporting on the UN and told him I was going to re-enter. People said it was only because of previous coverage that the UN was forced to allow even this still restricted pass. Then I called UN media accreditation and told them I wanted back in. Okay, go up to the pass office. They'll be waiting for you there. Not like last time when I was banned from all premises, I asked. I'd started using that online. Banned. Capital B-A-N, as in banned by Ban Ki-moon. I want to get in for the noon briefing. Then you better hurry. I walked north on First Avenue, the same way I'd walked down to the park after being told that I was banned worldwide. In the pass office, they were waiting for me. Didn't ask to see a passport as they had last December. Mine had visa and entry stamps from trips I'd taken with the Security Council in the past, to Sudan, Kenya, the DR Congo, Djibouti, and Cote d'Ivoire, and one ill-fated trip with Ban Ki-moon to Sri Lanka, where he watched 40,000 Tamils killed. There would be no more of that. Now go around the corner and get your photo taken. New pass, new photo. After the photo was taken, I handed them a letter. This was all without prejudice. I did not concede anything. I just wanted back in. I got in another line at the metal detector. One of the UN security guards I passed glared at me. The next one high-fived me. I kept my eyes on the prize. It was 11:56. Through the lobby with its carpet portraits of each Secretary General, including the Nazi Kurt Waldheim. Through a turnstile on the first floor. Here, my new green pass worked, as it wouldn't upstairs. Then along another hallway to the escalators. There was a cafe now in the lobby. To half replace the cafeteria closed down because the New York City Police Department thought a car bomber might target it from the FDR Drive. Up the escalator and down a hall to the press briefing room. The room I was thrown out of on January 29, 2016. The ultimate entrapment. Inside, Stefan Dujarric had started his briefing, which meant reading a series of press releases. The seat I usually used, front row, extreme left, was empty, but Lou Charbonneau of Reuters was right next to it. I squeezed in and turned on my laptop. When Dujarric finished with the canned statements, he called on Reuters first. Then he called on me. I had some questions about being pushed into the street with no due process, as he said, but I'll put those at the end. I wanted to ask you about Burundi first. I saw the statement by the Secretary General praising the release of prisoners, and I wanted to ask you two questions about that. One, is he aware, and what do you say that 2 of the 5 radio stations have opened, and they've been forced to sign pledges not to undermine the country's security? There were still no answers to a question like that, but I was back, in a way. The question was, for how long? And let me just add, a year later, I'm still restricted. The most disgusting organization. They had no right to throw out. There was no appeal. There was no hearing. And it doesn't matter. Ban Ki-moon's relatives have been indicted. Everything was proved true, and it doesn't matter. The new Secretary General was flying around the world with the same Stefan Dujarric mentioned in this, who helped get inner city press thrown out. He's kept the old guard around, and as yet has changed nothing. To be continued. Okay. Here we go. This is an experiment. This is from a different location. This is Chapter 8 of Uncensored, the story of the UN's corruption and eviction of inner city press. It's a different location and we'll explain it in an after-reading situation. But first, and you can follow along, hopefully, we're going to read it. The re-entry to the UN, after having to cover it from a park across the street, brought back to me that while it was Undersecretary General Christina Gayach who signed the letter to throw me out, some United Nations Correspondents Association bigwigs had lobbied for it. Some made it obvious. Michelle Nichols of Reuters said it loudly when I came into the briefing room that some people couldn't handle the cold and had to come inside. Walking to the Security Council stakeout, this time down the steps since my non-resident past wouldn't open the turnstile, Voice of America's Margaret Bashir came over to further block my way. When I raised up my phone to film Periscope, Michelle Nichols of Reuters pushed my arm down. Behind her was the increasingly wormy Louis Charbonneau, bureau chief, who told me he had a policy of not crediting inner-city press for its exclusives. For example, on Jeffrey Feltman. The boss of Reuters, Stephen Adler, when I'd emailed him and his deputies, never answered. Since then, he's said he's going to fight Trump. What a tuxedoed scumbag. That's a parenthetical. But the documents I got from Voice of America under the Freedom of Information Act showed that that's when they prepared to sue. Only the leak had stopped them. Now they were on a roll. I kept writing stories. Burundi, Yemen, where the UN's envoy running and fishing business and even a car import business on the side. Free press abuses in Turkey and elsewhere. But to write them, I had to sit in the windowless bullpen on the 4th floor with my headphones on. When I'd first come to the UN, the bullpen was right across from the spokesperson's office and by the elevators. You could get stories there. Now it was locked off on the side. No one seemed to care. There was no high-speed internet, no phones, no place to have a private conversation. The focus booths that were supposed to have been given out had been given out. It was a first-world problem, I'm sure, but at least 40% of my reporting was no longer possible. This seems to have been the goal. I had to fly the flag, I decided, to show that I was back. My pass no longer got me to the 2nd floor to the delegates' lounge this Friday night, but a woman from the Indigenous Unit of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs said she'd sign me in. They took my driver's license and said, "Don't go off anywhere, don't go to any other floor. Yes, boss. Yes, massa." Even if I see a corpse. The delegates' lounge was loud as usual. The spokesman of the UN mission, then as now, incredibly, hipster Curtis Cooper, who lived in Williamsburg, came over and said they finally did it. Later, he'd tell the New York Times that he thought I was like Lenny Bruce making his final jokes about his own court cases, but that's jumping ahead. A better source came over, one who will go unnamed here, and said he'd tell me how Gayach got her job, Christina Gayach. This I had to hear. We found a table, and he began. "How many people do you think she managed before being given 700 at DPI, he asked. I shrugged. 7, he said. You heard me right, 7. She was the spokesperson for Javier Solana. Then she wanted a gender equality job, but it got taken over by someone whose father knew Zapatero. Then a big deal in Spain. She waited around. Finally, when Spain was coming on the Security Council, Ban Ki-moon wanted to give them a post to buy a favor from them, and they put Gayach in DPI. It's a nightmare. Everyone hates her." He paused. "But you didn't get this from me." "Of course not. The conversation never happened." More people came over. I spoke to them one by one at a green plastic table in the back of the delegates' lounge. Some fight back had begun. But would it be enough? To be continued. Okay, here we go. This is take 2 of Uncensored. Uncensored. Chapter 9. Here it is. With sound this time. Hopefully. The key now, I thought, after the UN evicted me, would be outreach. I sent emails to UN officials who I thought might help. The list was short, and others, just to document that they didn't. Ban's Chief of Staff Edmund Millay. The Haiti killer didn't even respond. So I wrote to a generic scentral@un.org email address. I wrote to The Guardian and to Vice. They asked for a pitch, but they never wrote anything. And on the other side of the spectrum, to Fox News. They'd helped me once before. I was sending out more to press freedom groups when I saw online that there had been a protest in Sri Lanka, amazingly, about me. The signs were in Tamil, but they said, inner city press. They marched around the UN compound in Jaffna, saying I should be reinstated. I went to the noon briefing and asked them, then and now spokesman Stefan Dujarric, about it. This is getting personal, he said. But I'm not the one protesting, I answered. The UN Correspondents Association scribes with a new troll Twitter account started asking, who paid for the protest in Jaffna? Who indeed? I showed the troll account, soon to hit 600 tweets against me, to a second UNCA board member from the U.S. Broadcast Board of Governors. "I wish I could talk to you," he said, "but I don't trust you to be off the record." I'm on the record, I told him, speaking loud so that the UN television stakeout microphone would catch it. And what was done to me is on the record too. A minute later, Malu, the UN Media Accreditation Liaison Unit, emailed all correspondents that the UN TV microphone was there for diplomats and to be quiet. It was the content they didn't like. This was how the UN worked. I wrote to a UNcensored staffer who'd helped me before when Voice of America tried to get me thrown out. He'd moved up, now Chief of Staff, to a committee, but his response was to work through the U.S. mission to the UN. Like the Government Accountability Project's letter to the U.S. mission's Isabel Coleman, I didn't think this would lead anywhere. He said to come down to D.C. and to see him and his boss, a possible vice presidential candidate as it turned out, and maybe speak at the Heritage Foundation, where I'd spoken once before. Could the conservatives, the last remaining critics of the UN, other than the Tamils and Haitians and Yemenis whose relatives had been killed, get this turned around? The U.S. did nothing, but South Africa tried. Maybe it was just that their ambassador was nice, or that he was already slated for a UN position in Darfur and wanted to ingratiate himself to me. Whatever it was, he said he would speak to Cristina Gayach, the corrupt official who'd thrown me out. I tried to get him ready, the way she'd lied to Jose Ramos Horta, but he shook his head. He knew how to speak to people, he said. To be continued. And we're going to do an after reading. Hopefully the audio worked this time. This is a series. That's chapter 9. To be continued. 1 year ago, the UN threw inner city press in the street. And now it must all be reversed. Okay, here we are. It's Monday, February 20th. That's the United Nations. And this short periscope consists of Uncensored, chapter 10, regarding the United Nations, corruption, censorship, and as impinged on this evening, may he rest in peace, former Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin. Mr. Lee, that's right. So he was already in the text, but we've tweaked it a little bit. This is chapter 10. We're reading each chapter shortly. Here from the park to which the UN, in its absolute corruption and double standards, evicted inner city press, now 1 year and 1 day ago, without any appeal, continuing corruption by Ban Ki-moon's head of communications, Cristina Gayach, as yet unreversed by the new Secretary General. We remain constructive. Here's chapter 10, and then we'll have a little after chapter ramble. Hopefully you can follow along. With diplomats, political capital was to be spent on the problems of their country or their journalists. Some were protected. If the UN tried to oust a Moroccan journalist, which they wouldn't, for example, Ambassador Omar Hilale would be sure to protest. It just wouldn't happen. When Russia's Vitaly Churkin called out Reuters' Lou Charbonneau, an advocate then and later, the UN insiders, who ignored what bans Gayach and before that Voice of America did, sprung to the defense of corporate Reuters. A journalist shouldn't need powerless supporters to cover the UN. It defeats the purpose. But that is how it works. And the hierarchy, too. In a press conference to begin Angola's month as Security Council President, a non-favored journalist began a question about the impact of sanctions. Lou Charbonneau of Reuters cut her off. I instinctively flipped him the bird. Probably I'll be the one to get in trouble, I thought. Before, when Reuters Charbonneau complained to the UN for the first time to try to get me out, and it got leaked to me, he managed to get it blocked or banned from Google search, calling it copyrighted, saying he'd never meant for it to be public. Wasn't that true of most leaks anyone, including Reuters, published? But it didn't matter, consistency. The UN did whatever it wanted, and most missions just wanted to have their ear or fingers of the ear or fingers of the scribes at Reuters. Freedom of the press be damned. And so, without an office, I spent whatever time the Security Council wasn't meeting, the time I couldn't access the second floor due to my reduced access, down in the Vienna Cafe in the basement. 2 of the tables had electrical outlets. Both were on the outside, and people passing by would ask me, "How are you?" I didn't know what to say. They threw me out. Ban Ki-moon is corrupt. I just nodded. A guy who worked for the UN's caterer, who I'd known for at least 6 years, told me it was all Ban Ki-moon's fault. and just to wait for the next Secretary General. But that was then 10 months ago, 10 months away. Wouldn't I get all the way thrown out by then? Another guy I'd known for a while, a guy who worked in the office of the new president of the General Assembly, Mogens Likatov, told me not to worry too much about it and get an ulcer. Think of your stomach, he said. It's not worth it. But they don't deserve me to stand down and walk away, I told him. It's not about them, it's about your health, he said. Another journalist came and told me that after I was ousted from the UN Correspondents Association meeting back on January 29th, 2016, the woman who Lou Charbonneau later cut off, maybe that's why he cut her off, had stood up for me and said Gianpaolo Pioli shouldn't have said, you're mentally sick. He said that he and another had tried to propose that UNCA find another room, other than the UN briefing room, for its meeting, but to no avail. It was trying to cover that meeting that I'd been thrown out, and that all of this was happening. I couldn't get my mind around it. It was so petty and pretextual, but it was real. Had I made a mistake? But if not this incident, as Gayach had put it, wouldn't it have been another? This was Ban Ki-moon's revenge. So I emailed him and his chief of staff Malay a copy of the Jaffna video, a protest in Sri Lanka, to get me reinstated. Surely they would care, but they didn't. The Stations of the Cross continued. And this text, too, shall continue. In fact, in just a moment, we'll have a little ramble and talk about it. Okay, it's Tuesday, February 21st, and what will follow is a dramatic reading of an entirely true story named UNcensored about the United Nations and censorship of the press for covering its corruption. This is the 11th installment. They're quite short. You could find the other ones online. We're going to read it here in a park from which we covered the UN for 3 days after being thrown out through that gate with no due process by 8 guards, offering no resistance, laptops smashed on the ground, files in the street. But why describe when we can read? The dramatic reading, part 11, involving Jeffrey Sachs? Yes. Here we go. All right, well, there you go. Okay, so hopefully maybe you can follow along. Well, I'll just do it this way. Even evicted and restricted by the UN, I tried to keep covering it, for example on Burundi. Before being thrown out of my office, I had one morning seen a group of 4 protesters with a Burundian flag, and I ran down there. I broadcast the protest on Periscope, interviewed the organizer, up from Louisiana as it happened, Manisha Levin, and I put the whole thing online. That was right in this park, by the way. Burundi's ambassador Albert Shinjiro, who blocked me on Twitter, mocked my video of the protest, saying if only 4 people are upset, it's not much of a movement. Hey, it's a small country, with even fewer Burundians in New York. I blasted away at Shinjiro, and Burundians from Toronto and Kigali replied and sent me photos of soldiers who'd killed protesters and were now being deployed on Hervé Ladsus's peacekeeping missions. I was covering a meeting on Burundi of the peace-building configuration in person because I no longer had access through my office to the UN's in-house EZTV. There was no outlet, and I was live tweeting. Switzerland's ambassador and the omnipresent Shinjiro were thanking everyone. Shinjiro was thug-like when my phone rang. It was Jeffrey Sachs, all-around UN guy, to whom, like nearly all other UN Undersecretaries General, I'd sent an email about my plight. I went out to the Vienna Cafe, still loud. Sachs said he was traveling, but he wanted more information, that he would try to talk to Christina Gayach, who'd thrown me out. It was ironic, because I'd attacked Sachs in the past for claiming he was $1 of a year UN official when UNDP paid for his travel. I'd gotten a copy of the check, be careful, he told me at the time, and I reported that too. And here he was trying to, seemingly trying to intervene for me. I was impressed. This is not good for the UN, he said. It struck me that this could be the silver bullet. One of the UN's brand name outside supporters. Wake up and smell the Sachs Rwandan shade-grown coffee, Gayach, I thought. I sent him more information, then went to the noon briefing. I asked my usual mix of questions, 2 on Africa, 1 on Sri Lanka, 2 on corruption, then went and sat in one of the 2 benches in the lobby to type them up. That's where I had to work. I tweeted people I saw passing by and got up to chase UN Relief Chief Stephen O'Brien to the elevators. I asked him, the Saudi ambassador said you don't want a humanitarian resolution in the Security Council, like the one you got for Syria. Is it true? That was about Yemen. O'Brien stopped, said, I haven't heard that. It was on camera, I told him. It's all over the webcast. I'll have to see it then, he said. The elevator doors closed behind him. I went back to my bench. My laptop was still there, and tweeted out his answer. I could still report this way, I decided. It was different, but I could do it. Still, when it hit 6 o'clock, I went to the front of the lobby, facing the traffic circle they'd marched me around. There was a black sedan parked there with UN security. I would wait for Ban Ki-moon to come off the elevator and ask him why this was happening. I paced up and down. Guards came and stared at me, but none came over to talk. Though almost no one did this anymore. This had once been an accepted stakeout. A British journalist named James Bone had used it to lie in wait for UNHCR's Ruud Lubbers about his sexual harassment, alleged, of Cynthia Burzak. Bone had asked Lubbers to touch him as he had Miss Burzak, and Lubbers insanely complied, patting Bone on the rump. "I would do that to Mrs. Annan," Lubbers had said, captured on UN TV. Kofi Annan, watching upstairs, fired him. Those were the days. I waited and waited, but there was no Ban Ki-moon. Finally, the official who emerged was Jan Eliasson, Ban's Swedish deputy. "Yes, Matthew?" he asked me, as if he didn't know what had been done to me. "They threw me out," I told him, as security stepped between us. "Call Jeff Sachs," I said, hearing my own self as desperate. "Jeff Sachs, eh?" Eliasson said, by now to the door of his car. He was gone. I retreated to the far end of the lobby and started to write it up. My laptop was running out of power, so I plugged it and my smartphone in. This could be the break. Just then I saw 2 UN security guards approaching me. The older one, in a white shirt, said, "You know you shouldn't be here." "I don't know that," I told him. "The rules say that if I'm in the building by 7 p.m., I can stay working." The white-shirted guard shook his head. "You're going to have to leave." "But my stuff is up in the bullpen," I told him. "You have to leave now," he said. "What's your name?" I asked. I fumbled to turn on my phone, filming, to periscope the encounter. "Clyde," he said. "And we're going to move you out now." They escorted me through the lobby, like on February 19th. But this time I had my phone in my hand. "You know why they're having you do this, right?" I asked him. I wrote about Ban Ki-moon's connection to the corruption scandal. He didn't answer. I said a few swear words, and the next thing I knew, I was out on First Avenue again. This time I went straight to the park and its metal statue. I knew where to plug in my equipment. Adrian had shown me. I uploaded video and sound. I wrote an article. "The UN is hitting new lows," I tweeted. A few people responded, like a little Burundi. There's the statue. Over there is the outlet, and there is the still corrupt UN, from which inner city press is still restricted. To be continued. Okay, it's Wednesday, February 22nd, and this is going to be a reading of Chapter 12, or Installment 12 of Uncensored, which is a story about UN corruption and censorship, how they throw inner city press into the street, through that gate, onto the ground, 8 guards, laptop smashed, files in the street. The same spokesman is still in the house, still lying, still covering up genocide for the new Secretary General. Disgusting. But rather than pontificate, we're going to read Chapter 12, Installment 12, and we'll go from there. We'll do in a separate periscope to take questions afterwards. Hopefully you can follow along. I'm not sure if this is working, but so be it. Even the day after getting thrown out of the UN, the show had to go on. The upside was that there was sometimes UN news outside of the building. The downside was that often with other insider scribes and at close quarters. The German mission was having a briefing by its envoy to Colombia, Thomas Koenigs. I'd written about him soon after I had arrived at the UN. He had been with the UN mission in Kosovo. Now around the table at the German mission building's top floor were the United Nations Correspondents Association's insiders, Louis Charbonneau, now of Human Rights Watch, and Nichelle Nichols of Reuters, and Reuters retiree Evelyn Leopold, that was 3 of them, who loudly whispered that I was an ageist blogger. My point was, why should she take the first question for the UN Correspondents Association if she wasn't even writing any story with it? I asked Koenigs to compare the impunity provisions of the Colombia proposal with, for example, the lack of prosecutions in Sri Lanka. He dodged that one, but gave me other numbers. Just before the briefing ended, I gestured that I had to leave. I didn't want to ride down the elevator with this crowd. But out in the hall, the elevator refused to arrive. Others started trickling out. I pulled out my phone to live tweet or to mock tweet. When the elevator came, I went to the back corner of it and put my headphones on. I jogged back to the UN. Unlike the others, I had to go through the metal detector and the line with the NGOs and the tourists. At the noon briefing, after asking questions on Africa, I asked Dujarric about the second ouster. This is from the UN's transcript with all the left in. I wanted to ask you, yesterday evening, I was working in the UN, in the lobby. At 8 o'clock, I was editing a video of, in fact, yesterday's noon briefing, and I was told by security that I had to leave. I was marched out and left the building. And I wanted to know, since I've heard you and Ms. Gayach make various representations about this pass, what are the rules? What are the rules about this? What, on whose authority? I've seen other non-resident correspondents staying and working in the building past 8. Why did this happen? Spokesman Stefan Dujarric. Well, frankly, I think if you read the media accreditation guidelines for non-resident correspondents, which you agreed to when you signed for the new pass, it's pretty clear that it says that non-resident correspondents are allowed in the building between 8 and 7 p.m. unless there's a meeting going on. The fact that it is by 8 p.m. there were no more meetings going on. I don't think it's our responsibility to find a place for you to work once the meetings are not going on. I also have to access the bullpen, which is more comfortable than a wooden bench in the lobby, but that's your decision. This guy is scum, by the way. I just put this in. 1 year of eviction, total scum, defender of genocide, must be fired. But I digress. The point is, you have access to the press conference room, to the steakhouse, but it's not my responsibility to find you a comfortable place to work after hours. Only for my friends who write no stories. I'm not asking about comfort. I'm asking about, I've been in the bullpen. There have been people working there since 8 p.m., so I feel like I'm being targeted by security based on my reporting. The rules are that non-resident correspondents are allowed to stay in the building after 7 p.m. if they are accompanied or sponsored by a resident correspondent, like Masood Haider, like the people that Stefan Dujarric calls on. Scum. That's nowhere in the rule book. It only says that non-resident passes are supposed to enter between 8 and 7. But when the spokesman will just make up rules to justify whatever the guards do, it's like living in a little Burundi, with Ban Ki-moon, or now, apparently the new guy, as Pierre Nkurunziza. And Dujarric continued this. I was invited to give a talk in Washington, not about the UN, unfortunately, but about the previous thing I'd worked on, banks not lending in poor neighborhoods. I jumped at the chance to get away for a day like a rat getting chased in and out of the UN. Maybe I could rekindle relations with some congressional staffers, too, who had helped me when Voice of America tried to get me out in 2012. I emailed them and headed to Penn Station. Looking out the window at the wastelands of New Jersey, instead of being caught in the moment-to-moment struggle with UN security and UNCA scribes pushing my arms down while I periscoped, I started thinking of others to whom this had happened at the UN, or something like it. When I first got to the UN, bright-eyed and almost in awe of the old media correspondents in the briefing room, the New York Times wrote a piece about me as the first blogger at the UN. You can find that online. But actually, there was another guy, older, who wrote only online, Pincus Jewett. He wrote about the environment and ended up getting thrown out for failing some UN accreditation test of 60% of one's content being original. Of course, Akbar al-Yam, given my office now, doesn't write anything. A total scam. The UN is corrupt. Whether even 10% of what Reuters churned out was original was not considered by the UN. The goal was to target Pincus, who had the temerity to ask if the crisis in Darfur wasn't caused by climate change. People laughed. They started to cut off his questions, as they did more recently with Rhonda, who asked about North Korea. There is a groupthink and a hierarchy. Pincus was thrown out, but he said it was okay with him. He still got into the UN whenever he was in New York using an NGO badge. You'll keep fighting them, he told me. With Haider Rizvi, it was another story. He'd already been at the UN for years when I got there, writing about the indigenous and disarmaments for a place called IPS. He would sometimes drink and tell people he loved them. Once when Uncas Pioli was trying to talk me into taking an article about him off the internet, Haider came into the Uncas' small temporary room and said, "Why don't you two get along?" Pioli's response was to pour Haider a large glass of vodka and send him on his way. "That's all he wants," Pioli told me. I stayed distracted as Pioli demanded censorship. But why give an alcoholic vodka? Finally, Haider was stripped of his UN desk. The head of Malu at the time even called another media to which was accrediting him and told them not to do so. So Haider became, like I was now, a non-resident correspondent, trying to work at night in a corner. Guards harassed him. The Unca bigwigs mocked him. Finally, he left New York to his native India, where word reached me that he had died. I cried. Unca, who along with the UN killed him, put his picture on their glassed-in bulletin board. It was disgusting. And now they were trying to Haider me. F them, I said out loud on the train between Trenton and Philadelphia. I'm not going to go out like Pincus, much less Hyder. These effers must be fought. And then I turned on my computer using Amtrak Wi-Fi to watch the UN webcast. I tweeted mocking tweets and tried to prepare for DC. Wasn't the U.S. the UN's biggest funder? And now, in 2017, the time has come. Drop the hammer on these corrupt, censorious, wasteful, genocide-defending, Eurotras scumbags. Stefan Dujarric should be fired, just like Christina Gayach and Hervé Latsus. And we hope that Antonio Guterres can do better. The UN is corrupt and censors. Thanks for the comment. Okay, it's Thursday, February 23rd, and what follows is installment 13 of Uncensored, the story of UN corruption and censorship. And it's all true, sadly. And we're reading it from the park across from the UN, to which we were confined after being ejected from the UN by a corrupt UN official, Christina Gayach, by Ban Ki-moon, and yet Mr. Antonio Guterres has changed nothing. Nothing so far. 53, 54 days. We're going to talk about that in Periscope after this reading. How he met with freedom of the press individuals from CPJ, elitist scumbags. Anyway, let's read the story, and then we'll go from there. Hopefully you can follow along. Let me tilt the screen, try to make it as legible as possible. And here we go. After the UN evicted me for covering its corruption, I headed to Washington on the train. It was March 2016. Once I got to DC and Union Station, I had 2 hours before I was supposed to give a speech of sorts. I paid for a DC bike share pass and pedaled over to the State Department, parked my bike behind the Federal Reserve. It was time to ask Obama's State Department about the UN censorship, I had decided. There's a metal detector in the building on a side street. I showed my UN pass. The difference between green and white P passes was not important or noticed down here, and I went through into the labyrinth of the State Department. In their briefing room, the front rows were empty. I sat in the third row, and suddenly they filled up. The Wi-Fi wasn't working. "Good afternoon," State's Deputy Spokesperson Mark Toner began, handing the first question to AP, and then staying in the front 2 rows for at least half an hour. What kind of totem pole was this, I wondered. I raised my hand and used my phone to tweet it out. When called on, I cut in. I asked about Turkey and about the UN corruption case, including the Government Accountability Project's letter to the U.S. mission's Isabel Coleman, totally useless, that she should act on retaliation. "I don't have anything on that," Mark Toner said, while giving me quotes I could use on my other question, the Kurds. I left feeling it was worth it. Later I found a list of Congress member staffers' emails, ironically from a small and surely sleazy firm working on behalf of Burundi strongman Pierre Nkurunziza's government or regime. "We'll use the master's tools." I sent the email out. It was dawn in Washington. I was slated to go to the Federal Reserve in the afternoon, but my time was my own until then. There was a briefing at the International Monetary Fund, to which I usually submitted questions over their embargoed live stream. I bike-shared over there, went in through the security and into their small and hot briefing room. There were only 8 seats for journalists, all taken today, and 4 along the wall. I took up a spot, listened, and then raised my hand. The topic was Argentina's debt, the need for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, something discussed up at the UN. But here it was more detailed. What about the vultures funds who bought the debt? What would be the message if they got a windfall? That's not for us to say, IMF Deputy Spokesperson Bill Murray said. I asked him about Zimbabwe too. Then it was time to go. There's a spacious lunch and coffee place across the street with outlets for computers and Diet Mountain Dew. Ban Ki-moon was giving a live stream speech at Lehman College in the Bronx, that borough, my old stomp or get stomped ground. I tuned in and found Ban Ki-moon babbling, how the UN stands up for everything good. I emailed the guy I knew who would be there, a former Bronx State Assemblyman, who'd been ousted for being too independent. I'll try to ask, he wrote me back, but I doubt I'll get a question. I wrote and uploaded my IMF story, then got back on a bike for the ride to the State Department. I parked behind the Federal Reserve, then tried to decide when it was that I'd have to leave state, whether or not I'd gotten my question in. Play it by ear, I told myself. I wanted to get this question. This time the State Department briefer was John Kirby, But just before he started, the number 3 in the office, Elizabeth Trudeau, came over and whispered or hissed in my ear, "We just emailed you an answer, so don't ask the question again." I nodded, but didn't agree. Sometimes asking questions is all you can do. I got an answer from Kirby about Yemen, then reposed my question about the UN's bribery scandal at my ouster. The retaliation against the press, I called it. And I put it on Vine. Still up, I think. "I don't have anything on that," Kirby said. "Suggest you raise it with the U.S. mission in New York." That was the blow-off. Already that mission was doing nothing. Now they'd be empowered, i.e. Samantha-powered, to do even less. It was time to head to the Fed. I got there sweating and through security. Up in the boardroom on the second floor, I made a joke to Janet Yellen. Bike share problems. And then some people laughed. I wanted to ask her about FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Then Governor Jay Powell, who always denied my appeals, was right next to her. Maybe I'd throw Goldman Sachs into the question, just to rattle them. I did. The congressional staffers who'd helped me fend off Voice of America 3 years ago told me he was still in his office. He wanted to speak with me in person because he might see Gayach up in New York. Christina Gayach, that is, the most corrupt UN official ever. I pedaled over there, sweating even in March, and went through low-tech security. Up in his boss's suite, there were 2 TVs, on Fox and CNN, and a bunch of staffers on Apple desktops. "Come on," the staffer said, nameless here, taking me into a conference room looking out over Union Station. "It's like the last time," he said. "They say the other journalists don't like you." "It's not a popularity contest," I told him. "They don't like a blog competing with them. So let's go over it," he said, "the indictments and what happened since," I told him. "Right now it's all about Trump," the staffer continued. "Otherwise I might be able to get you a hearing. But I'll go up to New York and talk with Gayach. The U.S. mission will be there too, Isabel Coleman. They said they have a proposal." "What is it?" I asked him. "They might change the coding on your pass so that it opens the turnstile you complain about." He paused. "But in exchange, you'd have to agree not to tell anyone what has been done." I thought about it for a second. "That's a gag order, right?" I asked him. "It might be the best I can do," the staffer told me. And as it happened, it was. So that's installment 13. It goes from there. It gets even worse. The U.S. mission, under Barack Obama and Samantha Power and Isabel Coleman, corrupt. Will it change under Nikki Haley? We hope so. The UN under Ban Ki-moon, Christina Gayach and Stefan Dujarric, the last 2 of which still here, corrupt. Will it change under Antonio Guterres? We hope so. We'll start a new Periscope to comment on all this. But that is installment 13 of Uncensored. You can go back over Periscope. You can also go on the internet. 13 in a row. And there's more. Okay, here we are. It's Friday, February 24th. And this, what follows, is a dramatic reading, such as it is, of installment 14 of Uncensored, the story of UN corruption and censorship. It's all true. Slightly more than a year ago, Inner City Press was thrown out of the UN for covering the UN's corruption. It was thrown on the street through that gate, across the street from here in this park. 8 guards smashing the laptop on the ground, files thrown by the bus stop. We covered the UN from this park, while UN spokesman Stefan Dujarric arranged with his friendly scribes to do a colloquy saying, "Come and get your stuff." What a corrupt individual, as we saw today. We'll do, after this reading, we'll do a more lengthy explanation of just how bad the UN has become under these individuals. We hope for better, but until these individuals are taken out, no. Okay, so we'll do it this way. Hopefully it'll be legible. But this is the dramatic reading. Installment 14. You can find the rest on Periscope and on YouTube and elsewhere. After getting evicted and restricted by the UN, I tried to make my purgatory work. I found a way to get back to swimming. I had to be back in the building before 7 p.m., so I could only try to go to the New York City public pool on 54th Street Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. Even then, it would be a rush to get back. One evening, or afternoon really, a guard said, No. The rules say you can't get in after 6. I have the rules right here, I told him. I don't care what you have, he said. I have my orders. He was Eastern European, and I thought back to a long time ago. A long ago run-in with just such a guard when I used to play racquetball down in the 3rd sub-basement garage, where now I met some sources. The guard had written down my ID number, said he had to file it. They had a file on me, but they refused to show it when I asked. This was the UN. a secretive society where journalists don't even get to see their own file. A little bit of the Stasi on the East River. There were other refusals. I learned that there would be an 8:30 a.m. Security Council meeting about Western Sahara. I covered this every April and come in early, but this time, the glass doors to the council were locked and there weren't even any guards to ask manning the turnstile. I gestured to ambassadors walking in on the other side of the glass, like a goldfish. Some shook their heads. It was hard to understand. And they had other priorities, other things to spend their and their country's political capital on. This is what Cristina Gayach, the corrupt official who'd thrown me out from Spain, was counting on. Absolute censorship. I emailed the congressional staffer about this new exclusion. He told me to start an exclusion log on Google Docs, where we could share it. No editorializing, he told me. Just the facts. When, where, and by whom you were excluded. He said his meetings in New York hadn't gone well. Gayach had invited in a group of insider reporters and let them do most of the talking. Then, when he met with the U.S. Deputy Representative for Management and Reform, Isabel Coleman, at the U.S. Mission, Coleman had told him matter-of-factly that, hey, the other journalists don't like him, meaning me, Inner City Press. But is that what the First Amendment's about? What a scam. What a scumbag. Where is that individual now, drawing a salary for having destroyed the UN with laxity? That's editorializing. But it's not a popularity contest, I told him. He said he agreed, but all he could suggest was to start the exclusion log. I started to fill it in. Where my logs and exclusions got no respect was in the briefing room, the one I'd been thrown out of on January 29th, triggering all this, if only as a pretext. Lead spokesman Stefan Dujarric was away, as usual. Laziest individual, lazy spokes. Or on vacation, or hiding in his office, or out on the Hamptons. So his deputy Farhan Haq was in charge. Haq, even before the ouster, had told other reporters, as far away as Burma or Myanmar as he called it, with an arrogant overpronunciation he applied to every other leader's name, that Inner City Press told lies. He maintained this even in the face of leaked documents. Now he had the podium and he took full advantage of it. I asked why it was that the glass doors to the Security Council were locked and I got excluded. But you're not excluded, Haq said with a big smile. You're right here. He looked at the Unca scribes in the front row for approval and got it. He was like the nerd in high school, trying to get in with the supposedly cool group by being even nastier than they were. This remains true today. I'm sure they'd call me nasty, but one thing I don't do is to gang up. I told Farhan, or at least the UN transcript, I thought, that because the glass doors were locked, the only way to the Security Council was through the turnstile, but that my non-resident correspondent pass didn't work on it. That's not true, Haq announced, lying. I was a non-resident correspondent, a green pea, for a while, and I was always on the second floor. That's not the way anymore, I told him. Like 20 years ago, he'd worked at the IPS. That wasn't what got him the UN job either, I'd been told. His father was an economist, or at least a UNDP economist. Bubula Haq. Maybe I'd written that once, because Haq didn't hide his hatred of me. You're trying to obscure what you did in this room, he said. And what was that? You hid in the interpreter's booth, Haq said. Hid? The booths are glassed in. Who hides in a glass box? You know what you did and your colleagues do too, he said. Right? And if he had, at least one of these days, filling the front rows, would have said, yes, it was like The Enemy of the People by Ibsen. That's how disgusting the UN is. Incompetent spokespeople that couldn't work for the smallest company in New York City, stoking up the representatives of major fucking media, that did nothing when the press was thrown in the street and yet pretend to care about what's happening in D.C. It's disgusting, it's hypocritical, and it must end. Cushion. All right, there goes a whistleblower up the stairs. And on that note, this Periscope of Uncensored ends. We'll pick it up in a moment with a little Q&A.